I drove to the trailhead on the morning of June 3rd with my field pack, my instruments, my data sheets, my emergency kit, and the satellite phone, which I placed in the hip belt pocket of my pack where I always place it, which is where it is when I need it fast, which is when it matters. The morning was extraordinary. I want to be precise about that word. Extraordinary, not in the sense of threatening or ominous or any of the retroactive framings that the mind applies to ordinary moments after they've been followed by extraordinary ones. Extraordinary in the unambiguous sense of surpassingly beautiful, the way the Wind River Range can be after a major precipitation event, when the snowpack has been recharged and the sky has cleared and everything is lit with the specific brightness of high-altitude air after it's been washed by 4 inches of rain. The sky above the Fremont Peak Massif was the particular deep blue that only exists above 8,000 feet in the first week of June, the blue that painters try to replicate and can't quite get because the quality of it is atmospheric and not optical, the product of elevation and latitude, and the angle of a June sun, and the absence of particulate matter that the storm had scoured from the air. The peaks were white. Not the tired gray white of late-season snowpack, but the clean, brilliant white of fresh snow laid down in the last week of May over the permanent snowfields. And the contrast against that blue was the kind of thing that makes a person stop on a trail and just stand for a moment in the awareness that this is where they are, that this specific light and this specific air are the actual substance of their actual life. The creek moved over the granite. The water was the color of old glass, green and gray and transparent, and the sound of it was the sound I have organized the better part of my adult life around. The sound of water doing what water does, carrying what gravity gives it toward the ocean through the only paths available to it, patient and complete and indifferent to everything except the physics. I put my boots back on. I had one more upstream survey reach to complete, a section of the canyon above the gauge that required scrambling over a boulder field deposited by an ancient rock slide. A reach that was slower going, but that contained a section of bedrock-floored channel that held the best high-water evidence because the marks on the rock walls were more durable than marks on vegetation. I'd been saving that reach for the afternoon when the light would be better for photography. I picked up my pack, logged my departure from the gauge site at 11:27, and started upstream. That is where the morning that I've been describing ends and the other morning begins. I had been working through the boulder field for about 20 minutes when I found the tracks. I almost stepped on them. They were in a deposit of fine sediment that had been laid down in a low spot between 2 large boulders. The kind of fine silt that the flood leaves in hydraulic shadow zones, where the velocity drops and the suspended load settles. The sediment was still damp enough to hold an impression with excellent fidelity. It had the texture of silk when I touched the edge of it, smooth and plastic, the kind of substrate that would record the weight and shape of anything that stepped on it with the clarity of a plaster cast. The impression was approximately 19 inches long. I measured it 3 times with the folding ruler I carry in the side pocket of my pack, because I measure things. That's not an affectation or a tick. It's the job. You measure things because the measurement is the data, and the data is the purpose, and numbers that are not written down do not exist in any way that matters. 19¼ inches, heel to the forward edge of the toe zone. Width at the ball, 8½ inches. Width at the heel, 5¾ I knew it was not a bear track. I've documented grizzly bear tracks in the Wind River Range on 4 separate occasions, and I know the morphology well enough to distinguish it from this at a glance. a bear track, plantigrade, and broad, shows the heel pad and the 5 toe pads and the claw marks in distinctive configuration. The impression I was looking at had none of those features. The heel was rounded, but the toe zone was different. Not the separated rounded pads of a bear, not the narrow elongated toes of a canid or feline, not the split dew claws of a cervid. The toe zone was a blunt, continuous forward margin with subtle, individual demarcations that suggested, if I was reading the impression correctly, something more like separated toes than separated pads, like a foot, like a very large foot. I noted the morphology in my field log without assigning it a classification, because that is the correct scientific practice when you encounter evidence you cannot immediately identify. You describe what you see. You do not label it until the description is complete, and the alternative explanations have been systematically considered. The stride. That was when the professional calm I was maintaining developed its first small fracture. I found a second impression 7 feet and 4 inches from the first, measured heel to heel, and a third 7 feet 3 inches beyond the second. The 3 impressions formed a straight line running roughly north through the boulder field, toward the upper canyon, 7 feet between steps. I am 6 feet tall, and my maximum stride length at a brisk walk is approximately 32 inches. At a full run on flat ground, I can cover about 60 inches. 7 feet between impressions, in a substrate that records the indentation of the foot, but nothing else, with no sign of the running toe push that acceleration produces. Something had been walking through this boulder field at a stride length of 88 inches. I stood in the sediment deposit, and I looked at the 3 impressions, and I ran through the list. Moose. A large bull moose can produce a track approaching 12 inches in length, and in soft substrate, a moose's dew claws splay and register alongside the main hooves in a way that can confuse the identification. But moose tracks are cloven, bifurcated, and the morphology of what I was looking at was nothing like a hoof impression. And the stride length of a walking moose is approximately 48 to 54 inches. A person in large boots. I considered this carefully and rejected it for 3 reasons. First, the impression depth. The indentation in that fine silt was deeper than any human footprint I have made in comparable substrate while wearing my heaviest field boots and my full pack, which puts my walking weight at approximately 195 pounds. The impression I was measuring was significantly deeper, the kind of depth that results from a substantially higher force per unit area than I could account for with any human weight within the range of plausibility. Second, the morphology of the toe zone. Boots leave a consistent, unbroken anterior margin. This impression had the subtle but definite organic variation of individual toe structures. Third, and most practically, there was no other human being within 4 miles of this location. I photographed all 3 impressions with my field camera from multiple angles and scales, including shots with my ruler for reference, and I noted all measurements in my field log. Then I looked up the canyon in the direction the tracks were heading, and I looked back down the canyon in the direction they'd come from. They came from nowhere, and they went to nowhere. I want to be specific. The sediment deposit was the only patch of fine substrate in a 50-foot section of the boulder field. On both sides of it, upstream and downstream, the surface was bare rock and large cobble, surfaces that would not retain an impression. I could not determine where the tracks had originated or where they had continued. They existed in that small patch of silt as a complete record with no context, no approach, and no departure. 3 impressions in a row, and then granite. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have. Then I applied the most reasonable explanation available and moved on. The flood. The storm had deposited sediment across this entire drainage in a single catastrophic pulse, and it was entirely possible that tracks made in mud during the flood recession had been preserved in the silt as it dried, and that the approach and departure surfaces had been on boulder or rock faces that didn't retain the record. A large animal moving through the drainage during or after the flood, a bear, possibly, with an unusual track morphology due to the substrate condition, or a moose whose prints had been distorted by the damp silt in ways that made the morphology unrecognizable. Possible, consistent with the evidence, not satisfying, but not everything in the field is satisfying. Sometimes you encounter data you can't fully explain, and the correct response is to document it and move on. I moved on. The upper canyon above the boulder field opens briefly into a small bench, maybe 60 meters of flattened terrain where the canyon wall has retreated on the east side, and the creek runs against the west wall, leaving room for a strip of meadow vegetation between the water and the rock. Blue joint reed grass, tufted hair grass, the bright sulfur yellow of early season heartleaf arnica threading between the grass tufts, just beginning to open. Subalpine fir at the upper edge of the bench, the trees young and narrow and dense, the lower branches still holding the year's snow load, even in early June, the canopy above them in that brief spring condition, between the gray of winter and the full green of summer, that always makes me think of the range holding its breath. It was on this bench that I noticed the silence. I want to be careful with that phrase. Silence in the mountains is not rare. The upper elevations above treeline are genuinely quiet in calm conditions, the sound profile reduced to wind and water, and the occasional call of a Clark's nutcracker or a white-crowned sparrow, and the quiet there is part of what I value. But this bench was below the subalpine fir. In my experience of this specific location across 21 years and 47 visits, this bench in early June is not quiet. It is alive with bird activity. The dawn chorus is largely over by mid-morning, but there is residual territorial singing from the subalpine zone well into the afternoon, and the marsh wrens in the reed grass are typically vocal through most of the day, and the creek itself provides a constant acoustic background that is filling and full. Only the creek, no marsh wrens, no yellow warbler territorial call from the willows, which should have been present. No Swainson's thrush from the fir stand. No Clark's nutcrackers working the white bark pine seam above the bench. The birds were not present in the way that birds are not present when something has cleared them. I stopped walking, and I stood, and I listened for 2 full minutes, which is the standard wildlife survey protocol for passive detection, and which is also, if I am honest, longer than I would normally stand and listen, unless the silence itself had become the thing I was trying to characterize. Nothing. The creek. Wind on the upper snow fields, audible as a very low rushing sound well above the canyon rim. The creak of the subalpine fir in that wind, high and distant. No birds, no small mammals, no sound of any living thing moving through the reed grass, which should, in normal conditions in early June, have been producing the constant soft percussion of wind movement and small animal passage. The reed grass was still. The air on the bench was calm. No wind. The morning's extraordinary clarity had continued. The sky above the canyon rim was still that deep June blue, the sun at roughly 45 degrees elevation, and laying light flat across the bench in the way that made the arnica glow. Beautiful conditions. Still air, full sun, open terrain with good visibility in 3 directions. No birds. My rational explanation: the storm. A precipitation event of that magnitude would have disrupted nesting activity across the drainage, displaced territorial residents, altered the acoustic landscape in ways that might take days or weeks to normalize. The absence of bird activity was not evidence of anything except a breeding season interrupted by an extraordinary storm. I wrote that in my field log. Reduced bird activity on bench reach, likely storm disturbance. Then I walked on. The upper survey section begins where the bench ends, and the canyon resumes its narrow bedrock character. The walls close back in, the creek drops over a series of low falls, and the high water marks on the canyon walls are readable for a distance of maybe 150 meters before the canyon bends and the light gets too flat for photography. I'd been in this section before, but never in post-storm conditions, and I was reading the evidence carefully. Debris caught on protrusions at 11, 12, 13 feet above the current waterline. The marks on the rock wall showing the peak stage in a clean graduated record going up like rings on a tree. The smell arrived before anything else. Not the clean mineral smell of wet granite that I'd been breathing for the past 3 hours. Something layered underneath that. Something sweet and organic and deeply wrong in the way that sweet organic smells are wrong when they arrive in a place where they have no business being. The nearest word I have for it is bergamot. Wild bergamot, the Monarda fistulosa that grows in the lower meadows of the Wind River drainages, has a sweetness that is floral and slightly medicinal and unmistakable. But wild bergamot doesn't grow at this elevation. It doesn't grow in a canyon bottom. It doesn't grow above about 7,000 feet, and I was above 8,000, and the smell I was in was bergamot adjacent, bergamot-like, borrowing the sweetness without being quite that sweetness, and underneath it, something else that the bergamot was partially but not entirely covering. The something else was the smell of organic decay. Not violent decay, not the immediate assault of a fresh carcass. Older, deeper. The smell of something that had been decomposing for a very long time in a cold, anaerobic environment. The specific smell of material that has been kept, preserved, and is now releasing. A cellar smell, a soil smell. The smell of 10,000 years of accumulated organic matter in a place with no summer long enough to fully process it. I associated the smell with the flood, with organic material from the floodwaters, decomposing plant matter deposited at high stage, now drying and releasing volatiles in the sun. I've encountered similar smells at other post-flood survey sites. It was a reasonable association. Then, from somewhere above the canyon rim, from a direction I could not immediately determine because the canyon walls bent and reflected sound in ways I'd never fully mapped, a sound arrived that went directly into my sternum before my brain had categorized it. Not a sound you hear, a sound you feel. The way a subwoofer in a large room produces a pressure in the chest that is distinct from sound as you normally understand it, a vibration in the bone and cartilage, rather than an air pressure event at the eardrum. But this was not a subwoofer. It was organic. It had the quality of a vocalization, the shape of something produced by a living respiratory system. But it was at a frequency I had never encountered from any animal I knew. And then it resolved into a higher register, briefly, just briefly, into something that the human auditory system processes as a scream. Not a human scream. I want to be precise about that. Not in the shape or the pitch of a human distress call, but in the unmistakable quality of a vocalization produced by a large-chested living thing that is expressing something that maps onto what a scream expresses: volume and pain and force. Then nothing. I stood in the canyon and I waited, and my heart was doing something I noticed without being able to immediately address. Mountain lion, I told myself. A mountain lion with a fresh kill, which produces vocalizations during feeding that can be alarming to people unfamiliar with the sound. Not unusual in this canyon. I documented lion sign here twice in 21 years. Lions are occasional residents of the lower canyon, and their feeding calls in the right acoustic environment can carry farther and distort more than people expect. I wrote, "distant vocalization, possible mountain lion," in my field log. My hand was not entirely steady when I wrote it. I finished the Upper Canyon survey by 2:30 and started back toward the trailhead in the early afternoon light. The documentation was complete. I had what I came for: crest stage data, high watermark survey, gauge data download, sensor verification. The work was done, and it was good work, and the sun was still high, and I had 4 miles of trail between me and the truck. I noticed the sky changing when I was about 2 miles from the trailhead, still in the canyon section where the walls gave me only a strip of sky to read. The blue had taken on a gray cast to the northwest, which in the Wind River Range in the afternoon means one thing: a storm building over the divide. Not unusual. The range creates its own weather with a reliability that experienced backcountry travelers plan around, and afternoon convective thunderstorms are a feature of the Wind River summer from June through August. I picked up my pace. But when I came out of the canyon onto the open sagebrush section and could see the full sky, what I saw was not a convective thunderstorm. What I saw was a front, a real atmospheric front, the kind that Carol had not mentioned when she sent me in. The kind that shows up on the radar as a solid line of pressure gradient, pushing from the northwest with the particular gray-white wall of cloud that means sustained wind and precipitation. Not the isolated cell of an afternoon thunderstorm, but the organized weather system of a secondary storm following in the wake of the first. The wind came before the cloud did, which is the way a front announces itself. First the pressure gradient pushing the air ahead of it, then the cloud wall arriving behind the wind. Within 20 minutes of leaving the canyon mouth, the wind was sustained at what I estimated as 30 to 40 miles per hour, gusting higher on the exposed sections of trail. The kind of wind that leans against you when you're moving into it and shoves you sideways when you turn a corner into it from a different angle. The sagebrush was thrashing. The temperature had dropped 8 to 10 degrees. The sky to the northwest was solid gray-white from the divide to the zenith. I was making good time. The trail was familiar. I knew every rock and every switchback, and I was moving with the efficient pace of someone who has covered this ground many times in many conditions and knows where to spend energy and where to save it. I was going to reach the truck before the rain hit. Probably. I heard the tree go before I saw it. A crack like a rifle shot from the timber band 100 meters to my right, followed by the sustained crashing of a large tree moving through the canopy of adjacent trees on its way down. Then the impact, which I felt in the soles of my boots through the trail. Then a second crack from farther away, and a third, and I understood that the wind was toppling trees in the timber band to the east, and that I needed to be away from that timber, which I was, which was reassuring, but the sound of it was not reassuring. The sound of large trees failing in high wind is one of the more fundamental wilderness sounds, the kind that the body responds to before the brain is finished processing it. I was still a mile and a half from the truck. Then I came around the last bend in the trail before the parking area, and I stopped. The road. The 12-mile gravel road that connects the trailhead to the highway passes through a section of lodgepole pine about 2 miles from the trailhead. And in that section, the wind had done what wind does to lodgepole forest that has not been through a significant disturbance in several decades. It had found the trees with weakened root systems, the ones standing in saturated soil from the previous week's storm, the ones whose roots had been compromised by the high water table of the snowmelt spring, and it had put them down. I could see 4 of them from where I stood. 4 large lodgepoles across the road in the first visible section of the approach. Not 4 small ones. Mature trees, 30 to 50 feet in length. Root balls the size of a compact car pulled from the ground and now lying horizontal across the road surface, the crowns tangled together into a wall of branches and root structure that was not navigable on foot without serious effort and was absolutely not passable by a truck. I stood at the edge of the parking area and I looked at the blocked road, and I felt something that I am going to call the beginning of a recalibration. Not panic. I don't have a strong panic response. 21 years of field work in isolated terrain has either built or revealed a constitution that moves under pressure toward deliberate assessment rather than reactive action. But a recalibration of the situation, a recognition that what I had understood as a completed day, data collected, survey done, drive home, write report, was now a different kind of day. I assessed my resources. Tent. Yes, I carry one, a single-person 3-season shelter that I have had occasion to use twice in 21 years in conditions that did not allow me to return to the truck. Sleeping bag. Yes, a synthetic bag rated to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, more than adequate for a June night at 8,000 feet, even in adverse conditions. Food. 2 days of emergency rations in addition to what I'd brought for the day. Water. Filtration system, and 2 liters in bottles. Satellite phone. Full charge after the call to Carol. Emergency beacon. Tested and functional before I left the car this morning. I set up my tent in the open area of the parking lot, away from the tree line on every side, staking it well against the wind that was now consistent at what I estimated as 40 to 50 miles per hour. The rain started as I was finishing the setup. Not the heavy rain of a convective storm, but the steady, organized rain of a frontal system, horizontal in the wind, the kind that gets into every gap in your clothing eventually and makes everything wet and cold with the patient thoroughness of weather that has all the time in the world. I got inside the tent. Outside, the wind was doing its work in the timber. I could hear the trees going intermittently, the crack, the sustained crash, the impact vibration through the ground. Not nearby, 50 meters, 100 meters away from the timber bands to the east and north. Not nearby. I noted that distinction carefully. I ate my dinner. I wrote my field notes by headlamp. I called Carol at 2100 as promised and reported. Conditions stable, tent secure, no injuries, will be ready to help clear the road at first light. I was lying in my sleeping bag in a tent in a parking lot in the Wind River Range, with the wind pressing on the tent fabric in sustained gusts that occasionally made the whole shelter shudder. Outside the tent, the rain was steady, cold, the kind of rain that turns to snow if the temperature drops another 3 degrees. I was fine. I was safe. I was prepared for exactly this contingency. I turned off my headlamp and I lay in the dark and I listened to the wind. and I did not think about the tracks. I almost convinced myself of that. The print in the rain. I woke at 3:40 in the morning, which is a precise time because I looked at my watch immediately when I understood that I was awake and that the thing that had woken me, the absence of the wind, it had stopped. After 6 or 7 hours of consistent 40+ mile per hour wind, the tent had gone quiet, and the quality of that quiet after hours of sustained sound was the kind of quiet that wakes you, not dangerous, not wrong on its face. Fronts move through, wind drops, the system passes. Normal. I lay still and I listened. The rain had eased to a drizzle, light and barely audible on the tent fly. I became aware of the smell at about the same time I became aware of the other thing. The smell first, the bergamot sweet rot compound from the upper canyon, which I should not have been able to smell from the parking lot, which was not a smell that should have been detectable outside the narrow canyon environment where I'd first encountered it. And yet, present in the still air after the front had passed, not strong, not overwhelming, just present at the low threshold of detection, the kind of smell that might be nothing, the other thing. There was a sound outside the tent that was not the drizzle and was not the settling of the timber after the wind. A rhythmic compression of gravel, footsteps, not hasty, not running. The slow, deliberate, weight-bearing compression of something walking across the gravel surface of the parking lot. I want to describe what my body did before my mind caught up. My breathing stopped, not voluntarily. The breath just ceased, mid-exhale, the diaphragm freezing in a way that is not under conscious control. The body making the ancient decision to be as still and as quiet as it is possible for a living thing to be. My heart rate, which I could feel in my temples and in the pulse point in my throat, went from the slow rhythm of early sleep to something much faster in what felt like a single beat. The surface of my skin registered something I can only describe as a tension, not temperature change, not pain, but the specific sensation of the nervous system redirecting all available signal processing to the interface between the inside of the tent and the outside. Then the sound stopped. I lay motionless for what my watch later told me was 8 minutes, though it did not feel like 8 minutes in any way I can reconcile with my experience of time. I did not move. I breathed very shallowly. I listened with the specific total quality of attention that I don't think most people access more than a few times in their lives. The listening that is not passive but active, that is reaching out through the air with the auditory system at maximum sensitivity, reading every input. Nothing. Drizzle on the fly. My own heartbeat. Wind, very distant, in the upper canopy of the timber, well away from the parking lot. The creek, audible from this distance as a low, continuous background. Nothing else. I did not open the tent that night. I lay in my sleeping bag until the gray of early dawn began to show at the tent seams at approximately 05:30, and then I got dressed inside the tent with the methodical efficiency of someone doing a task while a significant portion of their processing capacity is devoted to listening, and I unzipped the tent door. I stepped out onto the gravel of the parking lot. The morning was still, overcast, the cloud deck high and moving east as the front cleared. The light, the flat gray of an overcast dawn at altitude. The drizzle had stopped. The gravel was wet and dark. I looked at the parking lot. There were tracks in the wet gravel, large impressions in the fines. The gravel surface of a trailhead parking lot has a layer of compacted fines on its surface, And in wet conditions, those finds take and hold footprints with good fidelity for an hour or two before the surface dries and loses them. The impressions were large. They entered the parking lot from the north edge, crossed the gravel surface in a straight line, passed within 8 feet of my tent, and exited the south edge in the direction of the canyon trailhead. I measured them, 19 inches, the same tracks, the same morphology, the blunt toe margin, the wide ball width, the deep heel compression. The same tracks I had found in the silt deposit in the boulder field, in a canyon 4 miles from this parking lot, in a substrate that had preserved them from the storm recession. The stride length was 86 inches, consistent with what I had measured in the boulder field. I stood in the parking lot and I looked at the tracks, and then I looked at the tree line to the north from which they had emerged, and then I looked at the path they had taken, straight across the open gravel, 8 feet from my tent, where I had been sleeping. And then I looked at the trailhead to the south where they had gone. The body's response. I was aware of the temperature dropping perceptibly, despite the fact that the thermometer in my pack later showed that it had not dropped. The cold I felt was not atmospheric. My legs wanted to do something. They had received some instruction from somewhere in my nervous system, and they were ready to execute it. And the only reason they didn't was that the instruction had not been completed, that the decision about what to do had not yet been reached. I was aware of the distance to the truck, which was on the other side of the blocked road. I was aware of the satellite phone in my pack, which was in the tent, which was 8 feet from where something with a 19-inch foot had walked at approximately 0340 in the morning. The mind's interpretation arrived more slowly. Something very large had been in this parking lot during the night. Something that had walked across the open gravel past my tent on the way to or from the canyon trailhead. Something that matched the tracks I had found in the boulder field above the gauge. The same individual, almost certainly, based on the morphology and the size. I knew every large mammal documented in the Wind River Range: grizzly bear, black bear, mountain lion, moose, elk, mule deer, coyote, wolverine, American badger. I knew their tracks, and I knew their sizes, and I knew their behavioral ecology, and I knew, with the certainty of 21 years of professional work in this landscape, that none of them had made these tracks. I took 12 photographs. I measured every impression I could locate. I noted everything in my field log, and then I sat on the tailgate of my truck, which I could not move, but which was solid and metallic and real, and I thought about what the locals say. In 21 years of this work, I've had plenty of conversations in the bars and diners of Dubois and Lander, the kind of conversations that happen when the field truck is the only thing in the parking lot that isn't a pickup, and the person next to you at the counter asks what you're doing out in the range this time of year. I've talked to outfitters, to ranchers with grazing permits on the forest, to the kind of old-timer who has been in the Wind River drainage for 4 or 5 decades and whose knowledge of the country is the kind that doesn't get written down. And more than once in those conversations, usually late in the evening and usually after the conversation had moved through weather and elk populations and the changing snowpack and into the territory where people say things they wouldn't say in the morning, I'd heard versions of the same thing. Something in the upper drainages. Something that's been there longer than anyone can account for. Heard, mostly. Rarely seen. And when seen the way you see something at the edge of your vision that isn't there when you turn to look directly at it. The outfitter who told me his horses had refused a particular section of trail for 3 seasons, and he'd never found a satisfactory explanation. the rancher, whose cattle had come down from the summer allotment in late September, all in one night, weeks early, as if something had moved them. The old man in the diner in Dubois, who had been on a pack trip in the upper Torrey Creek drainage in 1987 and had said, when I mentioned Torrey Creek, only, "There's something up there that's been there a long time." Then he'd looked at me and looked back at his coffee and changed the subject. I had filed all of those conversations in the category of folklore, local color, the stories that remote places accumulate around themselves over time, the way that any wild and poorly understood landscape gathers legend, the way a rock face gathers lichen, slowly, inevitably, because the human mind requires explanation for what it cannot otherwise categorize. I sat on the tailgate in the gray dawn with 19-inch tracks in the wet gravel of the parking lot going past my tent, and I stopped filing those conversations in the category of folklore. I want to be clear about the decision I made next, because I have spent a great deal of time since then examining it, and I have not arrived at a verdict about whether it was rational or not. The tracks went toward the canyon. The maintenance crew was coming at first light. Carol had confirmed it, and first light was 2 hours away. I had a satellite phone and a full emergency kit, and 2 decades of experience in this terrain. The tracks in the wet gravel were degrading as the surface dried. In 2 hours, they would be gone. I followed the tracks, not far. 200 meters to the canyon mouth, where the gravel of the parking lot gave way to the rocky trail surface, and the impressions became less legible and then illegible entirely. I photographed every discernible impression. I measured 3 of them. I noted that the tracks led directly onto the main trail without deviation, without the exploratory meandering of an animal unfamiliar with the terrain, without the hesitation marks of something that is finding its way. The tracks went into the canyon the way the tracks of a person go to the door of a building they have been to many times. I stopped at the canyon mouth and I looked in. The canyon in the early morning overcast was dark. The walls were wet, and the trickle of water running down the rock faces from the night's rain was audible even over the creek noise. The air coming out of the canyon was cold, that October and June cold that the canyon holds even on warm days, and it brought with it the smell again, very faint, the bergamot and rot compound, reduced to almost nothing but present. I stood at the canyon mouth and I listened. The creek, water on the canyon walls, a thrush somewhere in the timber behind me, a single tentative note at the very edge of dawn, testing the morning. Nothing from the canyon. I went back to my tent. I am telling you this because the decision I made next, not to go into the canyon, to go back to my tent and wait for the maintenance crew, was the correct decision. And I want you to understand that I knew it was the correct decision. What happened afterward was not a result of a bad decision. It was a result of being in a place where something else was also present, and the gap between what I knew about that place and what that place actually contained was larger than 21 years of professional experience had prepared me for. The maintenance crew arrived at 7:18, 2 men in a district truck with chainsaws, cheerful in the way that people are cheerful when they have a clear task in front of them, and the weather has improved. I helped them clear 3 of the 4 trees from the road. The 4th was a larger operation that would have to wait for equipment, and established that my truck could pass around the remaining obstacle on the road shoulder. I showed them the tracks. One of them crouched next to the best remaining impression, which was drying at the edges but still legible in the center. He looked at it for a while. He looked at the stride length I showed him, the distance between the 3 still legible impressions in the parking lot fines. He stood up. He said, "I wouldn't go back in that canyon by yourself." I said, "I wasn't planning to." He looked at me. He said, "You know the old stories about this drainage." It wasn't a question. I said, "I've heard some of them." He said, "There's more than stories." Then his partner called him back to the work, and I stood there with that sentence for a moment. There's more than stories. I drove the first 2 miles of the gravel road before I turned around. I can't fully explain why. In 21 years of field work, in all the difficult and occasionally frightening situations I have found myself in isolated terrain, I have never returned to a site after making the decision to leave it. I know what that tendency is. It's what gets people hurt, the going back, the one more look, the inability to leave a question unanswered when the answer is available, but requires doing the thing you've already decided not to do. I turned around. I told myself it was professional obligation. The data from the boulder field was incomplete. I had found tracks that had no scientifically assignable origin, and I had photographed them and measured them, but I had not completed the survey of the upper canyon section where the tracks had appeared. If I left now, the next rainfall would erase whatever additional evidence might exist in the upper canyon. If I came back with a colleague, the tracks would be gone, and without the physical evidence, the photographs and measurements were interpretable as anything, as distorted bear tracks, as a hoax, as measurement error. The whole reason was that the canyon had something in it that I had not been able to identify in 21 years of professional practice, and I needed to know what it was, and the need was stronger than the reasonable voice that was telling me to drive toward the highway. I parked the truck in the cleared section of road. I put the satellite phone in my hip belt pocket where I could reach it in 2 seconds. I told myself I would go to the boulder field, conduct a systematic survey of the sediment deposit and the surrounding terrain, and come back out. 2 hours. I would be out before 10. I went in. The canyon was different in the morning after the front had passed. The light was still flat. The cloud deck had not fully cleared, but there was a brightness to it, the diffuse white light of thin overcast after rain, and the canyon walls were dark with moisture, almost black in places, the water running in thin sheets off every surface and catching the light in ways that made the walls look alive with movement. The creek had risen again overnight from the rain, not dramatically, but the gauge would show it, and the water was slightly more turbid. The color shifted back toward gray-green from the clearer condition of the previous morning. The birds were back. That struck me as I moved up the trail. A marsh wren in the willows near the first creek bend, loud and territorial. A yellow warbler in the shrubby cinquefoil at the edge of the trail, moving through the branches in the fast, nervous way of small birds with a great deal to accomplish. The morning felt normal in a way the previous morning had not, and I identified that feeling specifically. The bird absence on the bench the previous day had produced, in retrospect, a quality of wrongness that I hadn't fully registered as wrongness at the time, and the birds returning to normality now was highlighting that quality by contrast. I reached the boulder field at 07:14. The sediment deposit was still there. The rain had not washed it. The hydraulic shadow behind the boulders had protected it, and the fine silt was wet and fresh, and the 3 track impressions I'd found the previous day were still present, rehydrated by the night's rain to a condition even clearer than I'd found them. I could see additional detail that I hadn't captured in the previous afternoon's photographs. subtle texture in the ball and toe zone that confirmed what I had tentatively observed before, that this was not a paw print, not a hoof impression, but something that shared morphological characteristics with a primate foot without being a human foot. I was photographing the third impression when the pressure arrived. Not sound, pressure. The physical sensation of a change in air pressure at my eardrums, the way pressure changes during a rapid change in altitude, or the way it changes in the seconds before a very large thunderstroke when the electrical potential in the air around you builds to a threshold. A pressure that was not quite pain and was not quite sound, but had qualities of both, localized at the ears and at the temples and behind the eyes, and increasing. I stood up from the crouch I'd been in and I looked upstream. Nothing. The boulder field, the canyon walls, the creek. The pressure increased. And then, at the edge of the frequency range, I could perceive there was something. Not a sound I could have named to you if you'd asked me in that moment. A vibration in the air, a frequency at the very bottom of audible range. The kind of thing that you feel in the sternum and in the ear canal simultaneously, that has the quality of a very large and distant engine felt through the floor of a building, rather than the quality of sound moving through open air. It was below the register of any animal vocalization I'd ever been proximate to, below the bass call of a bull elk in rut, below the chest-deep bark of a grizzly bear at close range, which I have heard once in my career, and which I considered at the time to be the deepest mammalian sound I had ever encountered. This was below that. The pressure in my ears had become something I could not ignore, a headache assembling itself behind my temples, in the bone of the skull, in the fluid behind my eyes, not yet unbearable, moving toward it. I looked upstream. A large subalpine fir at the upper edge of the boulder field, its trunk wider than I could reach around, its bark dark with the previous night's rain. The tree was perhaps 40 meters from where I stood. There was something behind it. Half a second, less than half a second. The specific interval between registering the presence of something at the peripheral edge of my visual field and turning to look directly at it, in that interval, I had the impression of size, of brown-dark coloration against the dark bark of the fir tree, of an eye height that was wrong, that was taller than it should have been for any animal I could name, of the sense, in that fraction of a second, of being looked at with a quality of attention that was not the animal attention of a startled or curious wildlife species, but something more considered, something older. Then I turned to look directly at the tree. Nothing. The trunk, the wet bark, the roots spreading across the granite at the base. Nothing behind the tree, nothing moving away from the tree. No sound of something moving away. Silence. The pressure in my ears was now a pain. I raised my hands to my temples involuntarily, which is a response I could not have suppressed if I had tried. The hands going to the location of the pain before the brain has finished authorizing the movement. The creek was still there. The canyon walls were still there. But the sound that was not sound, the below-frequency vibration, had become something that occupied the inside of my head in a way that made it difficult to process other inputs. I turned and I walked, not ran. I want to be precise about that because the distinction matters to me. I walked with the controlled speed of someone who has made a deliberate decision to move in a direction and is executing that decision, not the panic run of someone who has lost the ability to make deliberate decisions. I walked quickly back through the boulder field, back down the canyon trail, with the headache building behind my eyes and the smell of sweet rot present in the still air, and the birds. I noted this as I walked, the birds, silent again on the bench, the marsh wren quiet, the yellow warbler gone from the shrubby cinquefoil, as if the morning's brief normality had been revoked. At the canyon mouth, where the trail opens onto the sagebrush section, the pressure eased, not immediately. Over perhaps 300 meters of increasing distance from the boulder field, the headache stepped down in stages, each stage a reduction in pressure that I could feel as a specific diminishment, the way you feel the altitude pressure in your ears releasing as a plane descends. By the time I reached the parking lot, the pain was gone. I sat in the cab of my truck with the door locked, which I recognized as a completely irrational response to a situation in which a locked truck door was meaningless, and which I did anyway. My hands were not steady. I took 4 photographs of them to have the documentation. Then I took a breath and I started driving. Torrey Creek after dark. I made it 200 meters. I made it 200 meters down the gravel road before the thing I had not let myself think about, fully in the parking lot, assembled itself in my mind with a completeness that stopped me. The tracks in the parking lot, 8 feet from my tent, at 3:40 in the morning, moving toward the canyon. I sat in the truck on the gravel road, and I thought about that, and I thought about the sighting, if that was the word, if half a second at 40 meters through peripheral vision counted as a sighting. And I thought about the pressure in my ears, and the smell and the silence on the bench, and the tracks in the boulder field with no approach line and no departure line, and I was aware that I was constructing a picture that only had one coherent interpretation, and I was simultaneously aware that the coherent interpretation was not one I had any professional framework for. I called Carol. She answered immediately. I told her about the night, the tracks in the parking lot, the return to the canyon this morning, the sighting. I used the word sighting. She was quiet for a moment after I used that word. You've been doing this for 21 years, and you have always come home. Come home. I drove. The 12 miles of gravel road to the highway took 35 minutes because of the storm damage on the road surface, and I did not stop once. When I reached the highway, I pulled over in the turnout, and I sat for a moment. The Wind River Range was behind me. The Fremont Peak Massif visible in the rearview mirror. The peaks white against a sky that was clearing from the west. The morning's overcast breaking into high cirrus and patches of the deep blue that I'd woken up to the previous morning. Beautiful, completely, incontrovertibly, without qualification beautiful, the way this range has been beautiful every time I have seen it across 21 years. I turned onto the highway and drove east toward Lander. I drove for about 4 miles, and then I turned around and drove back. I know, I have examined this decision from every angle available to me, and I cannot fully defend it. I can tell you that it did not feel irrational in the moment. I can tell you that the professional obligation to complete the Upper Canyon survey was real, and the data there was genuinely valuable, and the window to collect it was genuinely closing. I can tell you that the daylight was good, and I had been at this site 47 times, and I knew it better than I knew most places on Earth. I can tell you all of that, and I can tell you that underneath all of that, the real reason was that I was not willing to drive away from Torrey Creek with something in it that I didn't understand. That the man who has spent 21 years in these mountains, specifically because the mountains are knowable, because the water does what physics says it does, and the rocks are what the geology says they are, and the data is the data. That man could not leave a data point he couldn't explain. I parked at the trailhead at 0845, and I went back into the canyon. And I went also with the specific category of attention that I have not used since. A watchfulness that was not the normal professional attention of a field technician, but the older, more fundamental attention of a creature that is aware it may not be the largest thing in its environment. The canyon was quiet. The birds were present again. The marsh wren audible from the first bend. A Swainson's thrush calling from the fir stand on the bench. The ordinary dawn activity of a Wyoming mountain drainage in early June. The smell was not present. The air was cold and clean and smelled of wet granite and willow bark and nothing else. I moved through the boulder field quickly, not stopping at the sediment deposit, not looking at the tracks. I had the photographs. I had the measurements. I did not need to stand over them again. The bench was normal. The bench was so thoroughly, convincingly normal that I stood on it for a moment and felt the cognitive dissonance of a person who has had a frightening experience in a specific place and then returned to that place and found it entirely unremarkable. The arnica was still there. The heartleaf petals opened fully in the morning light, which was improving as the cloud deck broke up. The reed grass was moving in a light breeze from the northwest, a cool, fresh wind, nothing ominous. A white-crowned sparrow was singing from the top of the tallest subalpine fir, its song the same song it had been singing from that tree, or its predecessors in that tree every June morning, for as long as I had been coming here. I walked up the bench and into the upper canyon. I completed my high watermark survey. I took 43 photographs. I measured 6 additional crest stage indicators that I had missed the previous day, and that would substantially improve the accuracy of the peak discharge calculation. Good data, important data. The work was exactly what it needed to be. I was in the upper canyon for 2 hours. The smell came back at the far end of the survey reach, at the canyon bend where my survey had ended the previous day. Faint. Present. I noted it in my field log and kept working. I was finishing my last measurements when I heard it again. The sound from the previous day. The sub-frequency vibration that arrives in the sternum before the ears. Far away this time. Farther than the boulder field, farther than the bench, from a direction I could not immediately determine because of the canyon acoustics. No pain, no headache, just the sensation in the chest of something very large and very distant, producing a frequency at the bottom of my hearing range. I stopped working. I stood in the upper canyon in the improving morning light, and I listened to that sound with every instrument I had. It lasted 40 seconds. I timed it. Then it stopped. The canyon was silent except for the creek. I put my instruments in my pack and I walked out, deliberately, 1 foot in front of the other, eyes moving between the trail surface and the surrounding terrain in regular sweeps, not fixed on any one thing, taking in the full sensory picture without narrowing. The way a person walks when they are paying attention without showing it. The way you walk in the backcountry when you know something is in the country with you and you do not know where it is. The bench, the birds present, the arnica, the white-crowned sparrow, the boulder field, the sediment deposit. My tracks from this morning overlying my tracks from yesterday, overlying the tracks that were not mine. The lower canyon, the gauge, the bedrock shelf, the creek at 6.41 feet, up from yesterday's 6.34, the canyon mouth, the sagebrush flat, the trail to the parking lot, my truck, the door, the ignition. I drove. This time, I did not stop. The road out and what it showed me. I need to tell you what happened on the road out because it is the part of this account that has required the most time to process and the most precision to describe. And I have not described it to anyone yet, including Carol, including the colleagues I've spoken to about the tracks and the sighting. I have described those things because they are documentable, because they left physical evidence that I can point to, because they exist in the category of things that can, in principle, be investigated with the tools available to science. What happened on the road out is harder to put in that category. I was on the gravel road 3 miles from the trailhead, moving at a careful speed, because the road surface was damaged from the storm and required attention. The truck came around a bend and the road ahead was straight for a 1/4 mile, and at the far end of that 1/4 mile, on the right side of the road, at the edge of the sagebrush flat before the timber began, something was standing. I stopped the truck. Distance, approximately 400 meters. The optics at that distance in full morning sun, on an unsurfaced road with heat shimmer beginning to develop over the sagebrush, were not perfect. I reached into the glove box and took out my binoculars. I put the binoculars to my eyes. I looked for approximately 4 seconds before it moved. I am going to tell you what I saw in those 4 seconds with the precision I have been applying to everything else in this account, and I am not going to embellish it, and I am not going to diminish it. It was upright, bipedal. The posture of habitual bipedalism, weight distributed across both legs, the vertical axis of a living thing that has been standing on 2 limbs for its entire existence. Not the temporary upright of a bear, which has a characteristic forward lean and a reliance on the forelimbs for balance that shows in the posture. Fully upright, the spine vertical, the head at the correct height for the body below it, dark brown-black. The coloration of the object was consistent across the body with the slight variation in shade that results from texture. Not the flat uniform color of a painted surface, but the complex tonal variation of a surface with depth, a surface that is itself organic and textured. The height. I know this road. I know every feature of this road. The sagebrush at the edge of the flat runs to about 3 feet at this section. The timber at the far end of the straightaway, where the road enters the lodgepole, begins at a canopy height I have estimated at 40 feet. I know these things with the precision of someone who has driven this road many dozens of times and whose professional practice requires calibrated visual estimation of distance and height. What I was looking at through the binoculars was taller than the sagebrush by a substantial margin and was not as tall as the timber canopy. It was standing in the open flat at the edge of the road, and I could not account for its height with any animal I know. It turned, not toward me, away. It turned and it moved into the sagebrush in the direction of the timber, and the movement was the movement of something walking with purpose in terrain it knew, not the bounding movement of a startled animal, not the crashing movement of a large herbivore forced out of cover. Walking, long strides. The sagebrush at the edge of the flat moved as it passed through it, the silver-green branches parting and closing. I put the binoculars down. I sat in the truck for what I believe was about 5 minutes, though I did not look at my watch. The road ahead was empty. The sagebrush flat was empty. The timber beyond was as it always was, the lodge poles dark and close set, the canopy a uniform height, giving nothing back. I drove to the spot and I got out, and I looked at the sagebrush flat where it had been standing. The ground was hard-packed sandy loam. the kind of substrate that holds impressions in wet conditions, but was currently dry enough to resist them. I found one partial impression, just one, at the edge of the road shoulder where the soil was slightly more cohesive. Not enough to measure, not enough to photograph with confidence, but unmistakable in its basic morphology. A forward toe margin, a heel curve. One impression. One. I looked at the sagebrush where it had entered the flat. The branches at the entry point were bent in the direction of passage, the kind of disturbance that a large body moving through dense sagebrush produces and that persists for several hours before the branches spring back. The disturbance was consistent with something moving on two legs at approximately my shoulder height. The upper branches bent, the lower branches not involved. The passage pattern of something whose limbs are high enough off the ground not to catch the lower structure of the sagebrush. I followed the disturbance to the timber edge. At the timber edge, nothing. The lodgepole duff was too thick, too compacted, the surface of it too dry and resilient to hold a track. The disturbance ended at the tree line with the finality of something that had moved from one medium to another and left the evidence behind with the first medium. I stood at the timber edge with the forest dark in front of me, the lodgepoles tall and close, and the light between them, the flat green-gray of a dense conifer, stand at mid-morning. I stood there for a while. Then I got back in my truck and I drove to the highway. And this time, I did not stop, and I did not turn around. It has been 11 weeks since I drove out of the Wind River Range on the 4th of June. I have submitted my data report for the Torrey Creek Crest Stage Survey, which is a good report, thorough and accurate, and which Carol has told me may be the most complete post-storm hydrologic documentation in the district's 40-year record. The work was done well. The work mattered. That part of the story is complete and clean. I have also submitted a separate report to the regional USGS wildlife coordinator, containing the track photographs, measurements, field log entries, and my written account of the events of June 3rd and 4th. I labeled it Unidentified Large Mammal, Torrey Creek Canyon, Fremont County, Wyoming, June 2024. I described the evidence in the language of professional documentation: morphology, stride length, substrate condition, temporal sequence, and I let the evidence speak for itself. I did not use any of the words that the culture uses for this category of evidence. I have heard nothing back about that report. I don't expect to. I have been to the range twice since June 4th. Both times to gauges in the lower drainages. In terrain, I have worked for 20 years without incident, in accessible locations with good cell coverage and regular foot traffic. I have done my job well on both visits, and I have taken nothing with me that I did not intend to bring back. I have not been back to Torrey Creek. Carol has not asked me to go back to Torrey Creek. She has not said why she hasn't assigned me that station. We have not discussed it. I want to tell you about the water. I have been working in the Wind River Range for 21 years because of water. Because of what water knows, and what water carries, and what water, in its indifference to everything except physics, tells you about the world it has moved through. The hydrology of a mountain drainage is a record of everything that has happened to the land above it. Every storm, every snowpack variation, every change in land cover, every geologic event that has altered the channel geometry in the last 10,000 years. The water carries all of it. The gauge reads it. I transcribe it. That has been my work and my reason and my fundamental relationship to this landscape for the better part of my adult life. I have been thinking, in the 11 weeks since June 4th, about what else the water carries, about what other records a remote mountain drainage accumulates and holds, about the depth of the biological history in a place like the upper Torrey Creek Canyon, where the Wind River Formation granite has been sitting since the late Cretaceous, and the drainage itself has been carving its current channel since the Pleistocene glaciers retreated 10 to 12,000 years ago, a tenure that makes the entire recorded history of human civilization look like a footnote. Something has been in that canyon for a very long time. Long enough to know the terrain the way I know the grade of the trail to the gauge, by memory, without looking. Long enough to move through a 4-mile section of remote backcountry in the middle of the night during a secondary storm, across ground that I navigate with difficulty in daylight, and arrive at a parking lot and walk past a sleeping person's tent and continue on its way without urgency, without any apparent awareness that the presence of a human being in that location constituted something remarkable. The way you walk through familiar country, the way you walk through your own place. The locals have a word for it, or the old-timers do, or they have a silence around it that functions as a word. The man in the Dubois diner in 1987 who looked at his coffee and changed the subject. The maintenance crew worker who said there's more than stories. The outfitter whose horses refused a section of trail for 3 seasons. These are not the accounts of people who have been frightened into a belief they can't support. These are the accounts of people who have been in this country for a long time and have made a practical accommodation with something that was here when they arrived and will be here when they leave. I think about that man in the diner sometimes. I think about what he knew in 1987 and chose not to say. And I think about what it would have meant to me at 23, just starting this work, if he had said it plainly. I have been still in that range for 21 years. And for 21 years I've been in the right condition, and the thing was there the whole time, and I simply didn't know what I was hearing. That is the part that requires the most time. Not the fear, though the fear was real, and the traces of it persist in specific ways. In the way I reach for the satellite phone before I reach for anything else when I'm packing for a field day, in the extra 2 seconds I spend looking at tree lines before I step out of the truck at a remote trailhead. The fear has been manageable. The fear is the correct response to a situation in which a large unknown animal passed within 8 feet of me at 3:40 in the morning, and I am not ashamed of it, and it has not stopped me doing the work. What requires time is the revision. 21 years of going to a place and knowing it completely, and building a professional and personal identity around the thoroughness of that knowing, and then discovering that the knowing was incomplete in a fundamental way. That the drainage I have surveyed 47 times and know by its geological designation and its rating curve and its flood frequency statistics and the specific way the light hits the canyon wall at 0847 on a June morning contains something I had not known was there. Not an absence in the data, a presence I hadn't measured. The creek does not know it's there. That's not quite right. The creek doesn't know anything. The creek is water moving downhill. The creek is physics. The stage heights are what they are. The discharge is what it is. The rating curve has been stable for 20 years. Whatever is in the upper canyon has been in the upper canyon for longer than the gauge has been there, and the gauge has been reading the creek faithfully all that time, and the creek has been carrying its information faithfully all that time, and none of the information in 21 years of stage record says something large and old and unclassified lives above you. the water is honest. It tells you what it knows. It doesn't know everything. Neither do I. I have worked the Wind River Range for 21 years, and for 21 years I thought that the range and I had reached a mutual understanding, that it was a knowable place, that its laws were physics and geology and hydrology and ecology, that the data I collected and the observations I made were building toward a comprehensive picture of a system that could, in principle, be fully described. The first morning I was there, before I went into the canyon, I stood at the trailhead and looked at the range in that extraordinary light. The peaks white against the deep June blue, the fresh snow on the permanent snowfields, the aspens below the snow line beginning the green that is only available in the first week of June before the altitude summer bleaches it. I stood there for 45 seconds, and I felt what I have always felt there. The alignment, the fitness of a person doing the thing they were built for in the place they were built to do it. I know now that something was in the upper canyon when I was standing there. I know because of the tracks and the timing and the physical logic of the situation. Whatever made those tracks was in the upper canyon on the morning of June 3rd, made its way down to the parking lot sometime in the night of the 3rd and 4th, and was back in the upper canyon by the time I followed its tracks there at dawn on the 4th. Which means it was there when I arrived. It was there when I checked my hands and started down the trail. It was there when I stood at the gauge at 0847 and smelled the wet granite and the willow bark and felt the alignment of 21 years of this work concentrated in a single clear June morning. It was in the canyon above me, and the morning was still extraordinary. That is the reframe. That is what I have been working toward in the 11 weeks since I drove out of the Wind River Range. Not the fear, not the mystery of what it is. And the range is extraordinary in ways that extend beyond what I had previously mapped, and the extension of the map does not diminish the territory already on it. The creek is still the creek. The data is still the data. The granite is still Cretaceous granodiorite, and the arnica is still heartleaf arnica, and the white-crowned sparrow is still singing from the top of the tallest subalpine fir on the bench. Something left 3 tracks in the damp silt with a stride length of 88 inches and a foot 19¼ inches long. Both of those things are true. Both of those things were true on the morning I stood at the trailhead and looked at the peaks white against the blue and felt the alignment. I checked the telemetry from station 091885, 00 every morning. The stage is declining towards summer baseflow as the snowmelt pulse ends. In another month, the creek will be at its summer low, clear and cold and very low over the granite, the kind of water that you can see to the bottom of in 6 feet of depth, and that you can drink without filtering if you're above the elk habitat. In another month, someone will need to service the gauge, the battery replacement, the clock reset, the sensor verification. Routine work. Work that I know how to do, that I have done 47 times, that takes about 3 hours on site and requires a 4-mile walk each way in terrain that I know better than any other terrain on Earth. I will go back. Not because I am not afraid, not because the fear is resolved or the picture is complete. I will go back because the gauge needs servicing and the data needs collecting and the work is real and the drainage is mine in the way that a field technician's district is theirs, earned through years of physical presence and careful attention and all the small moments of maintenance that add up over time to a relationship. And because whatever is in the upper canyon above the gauge has been in the upper canyon for longer than the gauge has existed.